I've often reflected that the most extraordinary events in life have a peculiar habit of announcing themselves with the most ordinary of beginnings. It was certainly true of the affair at Raven's Hollow, which commenced for me with nothing more remarkable than an invitation to spend the weekend in Gloucestershire with my old friend, Colonel Hartwell. "Capital shooting, Hastings," he had written in his characteristic scrawl, and a fascinating crowd gathering for Sir Reginald Pembroke's charity auction. The old boys finally decided to part with some of his collection. Medieval manuscripts, if you can believe it. Should be quite the to-do. I confess that medieval manuscripts held little appeal for a man of my practical nature, but the prospect of decent shooting and the Colonel's excellent cook proved sufficient inducement. Besides, after the dreary London autumn we had endured, the idea of crisp country air and honest conversation seemed positively restorative. Raven's Hollow itself proved to be one of those magnificent Tudor houses that dot the English countryside like jewels in a crown, all weathered stone, mullioned windows, and twisted chimneys that spoke of centuries of continuous habitation. Sir Reginald Pembroke, our host, was a man of perhaps 60 years, with the lean, ascetic features of a medieval monk and the sharp eyes of a successful collector. His passion for ancient texts was legendary among those who moved in such circles, and his library was said to contain treasures that museums would kill for, a phrase that would later prove more prophetic than any of us could have imagined. The house party assembled for dinner that Saturday evening was typical of such gatherings, a carefully curated mixture of wealth, intellect, and social position. There was Lady Pembroke, our host's wife, a handsome woman of middle years whose devotion to charitable causes was matched only by her devotion to her husband's collection. Miss Daphne Pembroke, their daughter, possessed that particular beauty that comes from good breeding and better tailors, though I detected a certain restlessness in her manner that suggested the country life did not entirely suit her temperament. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the family physician and an old friend of Sir Reginald's, completed our host's immediate circle. A distinguished man with prematurely white hair and gentle manner, he had the comfortable air of one who had attended 3 generations of the same family. The remaining guests included Professor Edmund Blackwood, a noted medievalist from Oxford whose expertise Sir Reginald frequently consulted, Mrs. Vivian Ashford, a wealthy widow and collector in her own right, and her nephew, Mr. James Ashford, a young man whose expensive clothes could not quite disguise a certain nervous energy that marked him as one of those unfortunate souls perpetually in need of funds. The dinner conversation flowed as smoothly as the excellent wines Sir Reginald had selected, ranging from the upcoming charity auction to the latest archaeological discoveries in Egypt. It was during the fish course that our host made his announcement. "My friends," he said, raising his glass with evident satisfaction, "tomorrow evening's auction will mark a significant milestone. After 30 years of collecting, I've decided to part with several of my most precious manuscripts. The proceeds will benefit the restoration of St. Bartholomew's Church in the village, a cause close to my heart." He paused, his eyes twinkling with what I can only describe as mischievous pride. "However, before these treasures leave my possession forever, I should like to share with you the crown jewel of my collection, a manuscript so rare, so valuable, that I have told no one of its existence until now." The effect of this pronouncement was immediate and electric. Professor Blackwood leaned forward eagerly, Mrs. Ashford's eyes sharpened with interest, and even the normally composed Lady Pembroke seemed surprised by her husband's revelation. "Reginald," she said softly, "surely you don't mean—" "Indeed I do, my dear," he replied with evident pleasure. "The Ashworth Psalter, 13th century, illuminated by the monks of Glastonbury Abbey. It has been in private hands for over 200 years, and most scholars believe it was destroyed during the dissolution. But it was not destroyed. It was hidden, and eventually found its way to my collection through channels I am not at liberty to discuss." The silence that followed was profound. Professor Blackwood appeared to have forgotten how to breathe, while Mrs. Ashford's face had gone quite pale. Young James Ashford gripped his wineglass so tightly I feared it might shatter. The insurance value, Sir Reginald continued with obvious relish, is estimated at £200,000, though its true worth to scholarship is incalculable. Tomorrow, after the auction, I shall reveal it to you all. Consider it my farewell gift to the world of medieval studies. We retired to the drawing-room, in a state of barely controlled excitement. The conversation, naturally, centered on Sir Reginald's revelation, though I noticed that several of our party seemed more subdued than celebratory. Mrs. Ashford, in particular, appeared lost in thought, while her nephew excused himself early, claiming a headache. It was approaching 11 o'clock when Sir Reginald announced his intention to retire to his study to make final preparations for the following day's revelation. "The manuscript requires certain arrangements," he said mysteriously. "I shall bid you all good night and look forward to sharing this historic moment with you tomorrow." We watched him go, a tall, dignified figure in his evening clothes, and I remember thinking how perfectly he embodied the image of the scholarly English gentleman. It was the last time any of us would see Sir Reginald Pembroke alive. The discovery was made the following morning by Jameson, the butler, who had gone to Sir Reginald's study with his customary morning tea. His cry of alarm brought the entire household running, and what we found defied all rational explanation. Sir Reginald sat at his desk as if he had simply fallen asleep while working, but the utter stillness of his form and the pallor of his complexion told a different story entirely. Dr. Whitfield was summoned immediately, and his examination confirmed our worst fears. Sir Reginald was dead, apparently from no discernible cause. There were no marks of violence upon his person, no signs of struggle in the room, no indication of poison or any other means of murder. The study door had been locked from the inside, the key still in the lock. The windows were secured, their latches undisturbed. Yet somehow, impossibly, Sir Reginald Pembroke had been murdered. For murdered he certainly was, as the subsequent search revealed. The Ashworth Psalter was gone. The safe in which Sir Reginald kept his most precious manuscript stood open, its contents disturbed, but not ransacked. Only the Psalter was missing, vanished as completely as if it had never existed. Yet how could a thief have entered a locked room, committed murder without leaving a trace, and escaped with a priceless manuscript without anyone in the house seeing or hearing anything unusual? As I stood in that silent study, surrounded by the evidence of an impossible crime, I found myself thinking of my friend Hercule Poirot and his often repeated assertion that there is no such thing as a perfect murder, only imperfect investigations. Here, surely, was a case that would challenge even his remarkable powers of deduction. A man murdered in a locked room, killed by no apparent means, robbed of a treasure whose very existence had been secret until hours before his death. The local police, when they arrived, were frankly baffled. Inspector Morrison, a competent enough fellow for routine matters, stood in the study shaking his head like a man confronted with a mathematical equation in a foreign language. "I've never seen anything like it, Captain Hastings," he confided to me. "No weapon, no poison that we can detect, no way in or out except through that locked door. If I didn't know better, I'd say the man simply willed himself to death." But I did know better. Somewhere in this house was a murderer of extraordinary cunning, someone who had committed what appeared to be the perfect crime. As I watched the inspector and his men go through the motions of their investigation, I made a decision that would prove to be the most important of the entire case. I would telephone Hercule Poirot. The afternoon train from London would bring my friend to this quiet corner of Gloucestershire, and with him, I hoped, the solution to a mystery that seemed to mock the very foundations of logical investigation. For if anyone could unravel the secret of Sir Reginald Pembroke's impossible murder, it would be the little Belgian detective whose understanding of human nature was matched only by his absolute faith in the power of methodical reasoning. As I walked back to the house through the gathering dusk, I could not shake the feeling that we were all of us guests, servants, and investigators alike, being watched by invisible eyes, studied by a mind that had already proven itself capable of the seemingly impossible. The murderer was still among us, confident in the knowledge that the perfect crime had been committed. But they had not reckoned with Hercule Poirot. The afternoon train from London wheezed to a halt at the small country station with characteristic punctuality, and I felt a familiar surge of relief as I spotted the unmistakable figure of Hercule Poirot stepping onto the platform. Immaculate, as always, in his dark overcoat and gleaming patent leather shoes, he carried his small valise with the precise care of a man who believed that disorder in small things inevitably led to chaos in large ones. His famous moustache was waxed to perfection, and his bright green eyes held that particular alertness that indicated his formidable mind was already engaged with the puzzle I had presented him. Mon ami Hastings, he greeted me warmly, though I detected the keen interest beneath his cordial manner. Your telegram was most intriguing. A locked room, a vanished manuscript, and a death that defies explanation. It is a challenge worthy of the little grey cells, n'est-ce pas? During the drive to Ravenshollow, I provided him with every detail I could recall, but Poirot's questions focused on aspects I had barely considered significant. "This announcement at dinner," he said, his gloved hands folded precisely in his lap. "Sir Reginald chooses this moment, this particular gathering, to reveal his greatest treasure. Tell me, Hastings, when he spoke of the Ashworth Psalter, how exactly did each person react? Not merely their words, but their faces, their hands, the way they held themselves. The body, it cannot lie as skillfully as the tongue." I did my best to reconstruct the scene, describing Professor Blackwood's obvious excitement, Mrs. Ashford's sudden pallor, and young James's white-knuckled grip on his wine-glass. Poirot nodded thoughtfully at each detail. And Lady Pembroke? She was surprised by her husband's revelation? Definitely. She seemed to recognize what he was referring to, but clearly hadn't expected him to announce it publicly. Très intéressant. The wife who knows of the treasure's existence, but not of her husband's intention to reveal it. This tells us much about the dynamics within the Pembroke household, and perhaps about the timing of our crime. At Ravenshollow, Lady Pembroke received us in the morning room with the controlled composure of a woman accustomed to managing difficult situations. Her grief was evident but contained, channeled into the practical necessities that death always brings. "Mr. Poirot," she said, extending her hand with grave courtesy, "if anyone can make sense of this terrible business, I believe it must be you." "Madame, you have my deepest sympathies," Poirot replied with genuine warmth, "but permit me to observe that in my experience, there is no such thing as an inexplicable death. There are only deaths whose explanations we have not yet discovered." The study remained exactly as it had been found, preserved at Inspector Morrison's grudging insistence. Poirot stood in the doorway for several minutes, his eyes moving systematically across every surface before stepping inside. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured, approaching the desk. The deceased sits naturally, his hands resting as if he had been reading. No sign of surprise, no indication of awareness of danger. This suggests either that death came very suddenly or from someone he trusted completely. He moved to the open safe with meticulous care. The thief was selective. Other valuable manuscripts remain untouched. Only the Psalter was taken. He paused beside a small glass dish on the desk. "You keep water here for stamps, oui?" he asked Jameson, who had appeared silently in the doorway. "Yes, sir." "It is dry. Yet here," Poirot indicated a neat parcel of papers with a freshly affixed gummed label. "This was sealed recently. Most curious." He examined the fireplace, noting the fine ash. "Who last attended this fire?" "I did, sir, at 10:30. I replenished the coal and stirred it properly." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. "You stirred it? But see, the ash lies undisturbed, as if the fire had burned steadily without interference." He straightened, his expression thoughtful. We begin to see the shape of our mystery, Hastings. Someone wished us to believe certain things about last evening's events. But fires, like people, sometimes refuse to cooperate with deception. As we prepared to interview the household, Poirot paused at the study door. "The murderer believes they have committed the perfect crime," he said quietly. "But perfection, mon ami, is an illusion. Somewhere in this house is someone who has made a mistake. Perhaps a very small one, but sufficient for Hercule Poirot to detect." His confidence was absolute, and I found myself believing that before long, the impossible would become merely improbable, and the improbable would reveal itself as inevitable. Poirot commenced his interviews with the methodical precision of a master craftsman examining a complex mechanism. He selected the morning room for these conversations, where the clear light would illuminate not merely faces, but the subtle betrayals of expression that often revealed more than words. I observed how he positioned himself to catch every nuance, every hesitation, every unconscious gesture that might provide a clue to the truth. Lady Pembroke arrived first, her composure admirable, yet somehow brittle, like fine porcelain that might crack under too much pressure. She seated herself with perfect posture, hands folded, but I noticed how her fingers occasionally tightened against each other, the only outward sign of the strain beneath her controlled exterior. "Madame," Poirot began with characteristic courtesy, "your husband's announcement regarding the Ashworth Psalter, this came as a surprise to you." "Completely, Mr. Poirot. Reginald could be quite secretive about his collection. I knew he possessed something extraordinary. He had hinted at it over the years, but the specific nature of it, and certainly his intention to reveal it publicly." Her voice carried a note of hurt that she quickly suppressed. "He said he wanted it to be a surprise for everyone, including me." "And yet you recognized the name when he spoke it?" A pause. I had seen correspondence, letters regarding authentication, insurance valuations. "But Reginald kept few secrets from me," she said with the faintest emphasis on the word few that did not escape Poirot's attention. "These letters, they concerned only the Psalter." Lady Pembroke's composure faltered slightly. There had been other correspondence recently. Anonymous letters claiming that certain items in Reginald's collection had been acquired improperly. He dismissed them as the work of a crank, but... She trailed off, then seemed to reach a decision. They disturbed him more than he admitted. When we later searched for these letters in Sir Reginald's desk, they were nowhere to be found. Professor Blackwood proved to be a man consumed by scholarly passion, his eyes bright with an almost feverish intensity when discussing medieval manuscripts. His knowledge of the Ashworth Psalter was remarkably comprehensive for a supposedly secret treasure. "The Psalter represents one of the finest examples of 13th century illumination," he explained eagerly. "The cinnabar pigments, the distinctive Glastonbury hand, if Sir Reginald truly possessed it, he was custodian of an irreplaceable piece of our cultural heritage." "You seem remarkably well informed about a manuscript that was supposedly unknown to scholarship," Poirot observed mildly. The professor's enthusiasm faltered. "Well, naturally one hears whispers in academic circles. Sir Reginald had consulted me about authentication procedures, though he never revealed precisely what he was authenticating. Dr. Whitfield's medical perspective provided crucial insight into the impossible nature of Sir Reginald's death. I examined him thoroughly, Mr. Poirot. No signs of violence, no indication of poison that I could detect, though certain exotic substances might escape routine examination. If I were forced to give a cause of death, I should say cardiac arrest, brought on by extreme shock or fear." "What could have frightened him so severely in the safety of his own study?" Poirot asked. "That, Mr. Poirot, is precisely what makes this case so baffling. Mrs. Ashford received us with the directness of a woman accustomed to getting what she wanted. We are to be frank, are we not? I intended to bid for the Psalter. Sir Reginald and I have been rivals for years. He outbid me for a French book of hours in 1929, and it rankled considerably." Her nephew James appeared nervous, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. "There's no point in pretense. I have debts, substantial ones. But I didn't even know the manuscript existed until last evening." Miss Daphne proved most observant of all. "Father was excited yesterday, but there was something else. A nervous energy, as if he were anticipating more than just scholarly triumph. When I asked if he was expecting someone, he denied it, but in that way that meant yes." As the afternoon progressed, Poirot's expression grew increasingly thoughtful. Each interview had revealed new layers of complexity, new possibilities for motive and method. Yet the central mystery remained. How had someone committed murder in a locked room and vanished with a priceless manuscript? "The murderer believes they have achieved perfection," Poirot murmured to me as we concluded the day's interviews. "But perfection, mon ami, is an illusion. Someone in this house has made a mistake. Perhaps a very small one, but sufficient for Hercule Poirot to detect." The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to take shape, though the complete picture remained tantalizingly obscure. The second morning of Poirot's investigation dawned crisp and clear, and my friend approached the locked study with the air of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. Inspector Morrison had grudgingly agreed to preserve the scene exactly as found, though his skepticism about Poirot's methods remained evident in every grudging concession. "Observe, Hastings," Poirot murmured as we entered the silent room. "The deceased sits naturally, his hands resting as if he had been reading. No sign of surprise, no indication of awareness of danger. This suggests either that death came very suddenly or from someone he trusted completely." He moved with characteristic precision to the desk, his keen eyes cataloguing every detail. "You see here the impression of the pen, yet the inkwell cap is closed. He was preparing to write, yet he did not write. Why does a man close the ink when he is about to use it?" His attention shifted to the open safe. "The thief was selective. Other valuable manuscripts remain untouched. Only the Psalter was taken." He paused beside a small glass dish on the desk. "This contained water for stamps, yet it is completely dry. And here," he indicated neat parcels of papers with freshly affixed labels. "These were sealed recently. Most curious. One requires moisture to seal, yet no moisture remains." The examination of the fireplace proved particularly revealing. "Note the ash, mon ami. It lies undisturbed, as if the fire had burned steadily, without interference, yet we shall learn that two separate individuals claim to have disturbed this very fire last evening." Poirot's systematic questioning of the household staff yielded crucial contradictions. Jameson, the butler, initially claimed to have stirred the study fire during his evening rounds, but under gentle pressure admitted he had skipped this duty while attending to cellar inventory. More significantly, young Elsie, the tweenie, revealed she had heard voices in heated discussion near the study at 11:45, a detail she had initially withheld from the police. "Two men's voices, sir," she insisted, twisting her apron nervously. "Not raised, but angry-like. I didn't dare linger, but it was definitely two gentlemen arguing." The most dramatic development came when Inspector Morrison arrived with what appeared to be damning evidence. A silver cufflink bearing the initials J.A. had been discovered wedged beneath the large armchair by the fireplace. James Ashford's face went ashen as Morrison produced the incriminating object. "This was not merely dropped," Morrison declared with evident satisfaction. "It was forced beneath the chair leg, as if during a struggle. Combined with the butler's testimony that you were seen near the study at 11:30, Mr. Ashford, it presents a compelling case." James's protests grew increasingly desperate. "I was in the study earlier, before dinner, when Sir Reginald was showing Professor Blackwood some manuscripts. It must have fallen then. I swear I didn't kill him." The circumstantial evidence seemed overwhelming. A young man with substantial debts present at the scene, with physical evidence linking him to the crime. Morrison's theory was neat and satisfying. James had attempted to steal the salter, been discovered by Sir Reginald, and in the ensuing confrontation, the elderly man had died of shock or a blow. Yet Poirot's expression remained thoughtful rather than triumphant. He examined the cufflink with meticulous care, turning it over repeatedly with his tweezers. "An ingenious theory, Inspector," he said finally, his voice soft, "and one that appears to explain much. Indeed, it explains almost too much, n'est-ce pas? The perfect crime, with the perfect culprit conveniently leaving behind the perfect clue." His green eyes met Morrison's steadily. "But the locked room remains, Inspector. How did our culprit secure the window from outside after escaping? How was the door locked from within, with the key still in the lock, if not by Sir Reginald himself?" Morrison waved dismissively. "A clever trick, perhaps. A wire, a string. Ah, but Hercule Poirot does not deal in perhapses without evidence," Poirot replied, placing the cufflink back with deliberate care. "This perfect solution leaves a sour taste. It is too neat, too convenient. The little grey cells whisper that we are being invited to believe a carefully constructed story rather than one that has simply unfolded." His gaze swept the assembled company. "This young man may be a thief, yes. But a murderer capable of such elaborate deception? I think not. The true culprit, Inspector, remains among us, and they are laughing at our haste to accept the obvious answer." The silence that followed was profound, charged with the uncomfortable realization that if James Ashford was not guilty, then the real murderer was still free, still confident in their seemingly perfect crime. Inspector Morrison arrived at breakfast in a belligerent mood, his jaw set with the determination of a man who believed he had solved an impossible case. "I'll be charging young Ashford within the hour," he announced, buttering his toast with unnecessary vigor. "The evidence is clear enough. Motive, opportunity, and that cufflink places him at the scene during the crucial time." Poirot received this declaration with the polite attention one might accord an enthusiastic amateur reciting poetry. He inclined his head courteously while arranging his napkin with characteristic precision. "If you arrest the wrong man quickly, Inspector, it merely obliges you to release him slowly. Perhaps you would permit me one small experiment before you proceed." Morrison's snort of derision was audible, but he grudgingly agreed to delay his arrest. Poirot rose from the table, his movements deliberate and purposeful. "Mesdames et messieurs, I shall require your assistance with a small demonstration. Nothing dramatic, merely a test of ordinary habits." He selected the library for his experiment, requesting that Jameson bring the packet of gummed labels from Sir Reginald's desk, along with the small glass dish that had contained water for moistening stamps. The assembled company watched with curiosity as Poirot arranged these simple objects on the writing table. "We shall recreate Sir Reginald's final preparations," Poirot announced. "Each of you will be so kind as to affix one label to this blank envelope, exactly as you would have done in similar circumstances." Lady Pembroke approached first, her movements reflecting the quiet efficiency of long practice. Finding the dish empty, she rang for water without comment, waiting patiently for the servant to fill it before moistening her label. Professor Blackwood followed with scholarly precision, though his color was high as he licked the corner of his label with evident distaste. "Hardly hygienic," he muttered, "but one does what one must." Mrs. Ashford's response proved most illuminating. From her reticule, she produced a small silver-mounted sponge with the matter-of-fact air of someone always prepared for such contingencies. "I never lick adhesive surfaces," she declared crisply. "The practice is most unsanitary." Young James, clearly nervous under the scrutiny, imitated the professor's method, while Miss Daphne followed her mother's example of requesting water. Dr. Whitfield, when his turn arrived, hesitated almost imperceptibly, a pause so brief that only the most careful observer would have noticed. "Best not for me," he said with an apologetic smile. "These old gums of mine are rather sensitive. I shall await the water if you don't mind." Poirot thanked each participant with grave courtesy, but I observed that his attention had been focused not on their mouths, but on their hands, their expressions, their unconscious reactions to his seemingly innocent request. When the demonstration concluded, he carefully replaced the packet of labels, his green eyes bright with satisfaction. "Most instructive," he murmured to me as the others dispersed. "Observe, Hastings. We have just witnessed a fascinating study in human nature. Some lick without thought, others prepare for the necessity, and still others avoid it entirely. But consider this. If Sir Reginald's water dish was found completely dry, yet freshly sealed packages were discovered on his desk, what does this tell us?" The implication struck me like a physical blow. "Someone wanted the licking to occur," I said slowly. "Someone who knew that moisture would be required." "Précisément, mon ami, and who among our company came prepared with their own moistening device? Who demonstrated such careful attention to avoiding contact with potentially contaminated surfaces?" Before I could respond, Poirot had moved on to his next stratagem. He requested a private word with Inspector Morrison, and I watched as he spoke earnestly to the increasingly skeptical policeman. Whatever he proposed must have been persuasive, for Morrison's expression gradually shifted from irritation to grudging interest. At luncheon, Morrison made his announcement with theatrical gravity. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to inform you that we have discovered the location of the missing Ashworth Salter. My men are being dispatched to retrieve it as we speak." The effect was immediate and electric. Professor Blackwood began chattering rapidly about proper cataloguing procedures, his words tumbling over each other in his excitement. Mrs. Ashford's spoon rang sharply against her plate, the sound cutting through the conversation like a bell. Lady Pembroke's knuckles whitened as she gripped her napkin with unconscious force. But it was Dr. Whitfield's reaction that proved most revealing. His gaze shifted involuntarily to the mantel clock, a movement so swift and instinctive that he clearly regretted it the moment it occurred. He recovered his composure instantly, but Poirot's keen eyes had caught the telltale gesture. "Fascinating," Poirot murmured to me as we withdrew to the study after the meal. "Our murderer prides themselves on perfection, yet they cannot entirely suppress their natural reflexes. The mention of recovering the Salter prompted an immediate concern about timing, most illuminating indeed." As we stood in the silent study, Poirot's expression grew increasingly thoughtful. "The pieces begin to arrange themselves, Hastings. We have a victim who trusted his killer enough to admit them to his private sanctuary. We have evidence of careful preparation involving potentially contaminated adhesive surfaces. We have a murderer who came equipped to avoid such contamination, and who demonstrates an acute awareness of timing when the recovery of the stolen manuscript is mentioned." "But how does this solve the locked room mystery?" I asked. Poirot smiled with evident satisfaction. "Ah, that is perhaps the most elegant aspect of this crime. Our murderer did not need to escape from the locked room, mon ami, because they never left it. Consider this. What if the person who killed Sir Reginald was someone who had every legitimate reason to be found in that study? Someone whose presence there would occasion no surprise whatsoever?" The implications of this theory sent a chill through me. If Poirot was correct, then the murderer had not only committed the perfect crime, but had brazenly remained to play the role of innocent discoverer. The locked room was not an obstacle to be overcome, but a stage upon which the final act of deception would be performed. As evening approached, I could sense that we were moving toward the climax of this extraordinary case. The murderer, confident in their seemingly perfect crime, had no idea that Hercule Poirot's little grey cells had already begun to unravel the intricate web of deception they had so carefully constructed. The evening descended upon Raven's Hollow like a shroud, bringing with it an atmosphere of barely contained tension that seemed to permeate every corner of the ancient house. Poirot moved through the corridors with the measured precision of a master strategist, his keen eyes noting the subtle changes in behavior that marked his quarry's growing unease. The household had fractured into restless fragments, each member seeking solace in solitude or the hollow comfort of meaningless conversation. Inspector Morrison's confidence in his case against James Ashford had begun to waver under Poirot's gentle but persistent questioning. "The evidence seems clear enough," he muttered over brandy in the smoking room. "But I'll grant you this. The locked room business still troubles me. How does a man commit murder and then lock himself out of the scene?" "Perhaps, mon ami," Poirot suggested with characteristic mildness, "we have been approaching the problem from the wrong direction. What if our murderer never needed to leave the locked room because they had every legitimate reason to be found there?" The Belgian detective's most audacious stroke came after dinner, when he approached Morrison with a proposal that bordered on the theatrical. "I believe the time has come to reconstruct the events of Saturday evening," he announced to the assembled company. "Not merely through words, but through action. Each of you will be so kind as to recreate your movements with absolute precision." The reaction was immediate and telling. Most showed the expected reluctance mixed with morbid curiosity, but Dr. Whitfield's response revealed something more complex. A flash of calculation quickly suppressed, as if mental adjustments were being made to accommodate this unexpected development. The reconstruction began at 10:30, precisely matching the timeline of that fatal evening. Jameson was instructed to follow his exact routine, including the cellar inventory that had prevented him from attending to the study fire. As each person moved through their claimed sequence of events, Poirot positioned himself as an invisible observer, his attention focused not on their words but on their unconscious gestures, their hesitations, their involuntary reactions to specific moments in the timeline. The most crucial moment came when Dr. Whitfield was asked to demonstrate his final check on Sir Reginald's well-being. "I knocked gently," he explained, approaching the study door with evident reluctance. "When there was no immediate response, I tried the handle and found it locked. I called out softly, but hearing nothing, I assumed he had retired for the night." "But you did not actually see him retire?" Poirot inquired with deceptive casualness. "No, I assumed he was still working when I made my rounds at 11:15. The light was visible beneath the door." Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. "Ah, the light, and you are certain of this detail?" Dr. Whitfield's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Poirot caught it. "Quite certain. Though now that I consider it, the light seemed different somehow. Dimmer than usual, perhaps." This seemingly innocuous observation sparked something in Poirot's expression, a look of sudden comprehension that suggested a crucial piece of the puzzle had just fallen into place. He excused himself briefly, returning with a candle from the dining-room sideboard and positioning it on Sir Reginald's desk. From the corridor, the candlelight beneath the door was indeed dimmer than the electric lamp would have produced, yet sufficient to suggest occupancy to a casual observer. "Most illuminating," Poirot murmured, and I caught the subtle emphasis he placed on the word. The demonstration had revealed something significant about timing and deception, though the full implications remained tantalizingly unclear. As the evening progressed, Poirot continued his psychological campaign with surgical precision. To Lady Pembroke, he mentioned the unfortunate disappearance of those anonymous letters her husband had received. To Mrs. Ashford, he admired her silver-mounted sponge and wondered aloud about proper disinfection procedures. To Dr. Whitfield, he observed almost casually that modern laboratory techniques had become remarkably sophisticated in detecting minute traces of various substances, even after considerable time had passed. The doctor's reaction to this last comment was subtle but unmistakable, a slight tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible stiffening of posture that spoke of a man suddenly aware that his carefully constructed defenses might not be as impregnable as he had believed. The evening's most dramatic moment came near midnight, when a soft sound from the direction of the library drew our attention. Poirot had anticipated this development, positioning himself where he could observe without being seen. A shadowy figure moved with practiced stealth, seeking something with urgent desperation. The intruder's movements betrayed intimate knowledge of the house's layout, and when they fled at our approach, they chose the servants' passage with the instinct of someone thoroughly familiar with Ravenshallow's hidden routes. We found only traces of their passage, a crushed glass ampule whose sharp medicinal scent lingered in the air, and the unmistakable evidence that someone had been desperately seeking the packet of labels from Sir Reginald's desk. Labels that Poirot had deliberately mentioned as being subjected to laboratory analysis. The guilty conscience cannot bear uncertainty, Poirot observed as we examined the scene. Our murderer has revealed themselves through their very desperation to eliminate evidence that might not even exist. Before we retired, Miss Daphne sought a private word with Poirot, her pale face reflecting the strain of the evening's events. "You asked if father expected anyone that last night," she said quietly. I remembered something else. When I kissed him good night, he said, "If Marcus calls, send him in. I won't be long." When I mentioned that Dr. Whitfield had already retired, he looked annoyed and said, "No matter, tomorrow will serve." Poirot received this information with grave attention. "Most significant, mademoiselle. Your father was expecting Dr. Whitfield to call upon him that evening. This changes our understanding of the timeline considerably." As we finally sought our beds, I could sense that the psychological net was tightening around our quarry. The murderer, who had believed themselves safe behind the facade of an impossible crime, was beginning to understand that Hercule Poirot's methods reached beyond physical evidence into the realm of human psychology. The perfect crime was revealing its imperfections, one carefully observed reaction at a time. The game of cat and mouse was approaching its climax, and I knew that before another day passed, the truth would finally emerge from the shadows that had shrouded this most perplexing case. The morning brought with it an oppressive stillness that seemed to press against the ancient walls of Ravenshollow like a gathering storm. Poirot descended to breakfast with the measured precision of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation, his green eyes bright with that particular intensity that indicated his little grey cells had begun to arrange the puzzle pieces into their inevitable pattern. Dr. Whitfield appeared at the breakfast table looking haggard, his usually immaculate appearance showing the strain of sleepless nights. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup, and I noticed how his gaze kept drifting toward the windows as if calculating distances or planning escape routes. The confident physician who had examined Sir Reginald's body with professional detachment had been replaced by a man clearly wrestling with invisible demons. "Doctor," Poirot addressed him with characteristic courtesy, "you mentioned that certain exotic substances might escape routine post-mortem examination. As a medical man, you would naturally be familiar with such compounds and their effects upon the human system." The doctor's cup rattled against its saucer with unnatural loudness in the quiet room. "To some degree, yes, though my practice concerns itself primarily with healing rather than forensic matters." But surely the principles remain similar. The absorption of substances through various means, the rapidity with which certain compounds might affect cardiac function. Poirot's tone remained conversational, but I sensed the steel beneath the silk. For instance, digitalis compounds extracted from common garden plants, foxglove perhaps, concentrated through simple chemical processes that any competent physician might accomplish. The color drained from Dr. Whitfield's face, but before he could respond, a commotion from the direction of the study drew our attention. Lady Pembroke's voice called out in alarm, and we rushed to find a thin tendril of smoke curling from beneath the study door. Inspector Morrison forced the door while Jameson beat out the small but deliberate fire that had been consuming papers on Sir Reginald's desk. The acrid smell that filled the room carried an oddly medicinal undertone that made my skin crawl with recognition, though I could not immediately place it. Poirot knelt beside the charred remains with the careful attention of an archaeologist examining precious artifacts. Using his tweezers, he lifted what appeared to be the remnants of gummed labels, their edges blackened but their centers partially preserved. "Most instructive," he murmured. Someone wished very much that these particular items should be destroyed. But fire, like truth, sometimes refuses to cooperate completely with deception. "An accident, surely," Dr. Whitfield suggested, his voice strained. "Perhaps a spark from the fireplace." "Non, Doctor. Observe the pattern of burning. This fire was set deliberately, with careful attention to consuming specific materials, while leaving others untouched." Poirot's gaze moved to the intact manuscripts in the open safe, then back to the destroyed labels. The question becomes, what story did these labels tell that someone found so threatening? As the smoke cleared, Lady Pembroke approached with evident reluctance, drawing a folded paper from her reticule. "Mr. Poirot, I fear I have done wrong to withhold this. After yesterday's events, I can no longer remain silent." She handed him what appeared to be a letter, its edges singed as if it had been hastily rescued from flames. "This came 3 days ago. There were others, but they are gone." Poirot read the letter with growing interest, his eyebrows rising slightly. "The truth will emerge," he quoted. "A physician's betrayal cannot remain hidden forever. The Psalter was purchased with blood money, and justice will be served." He looked up with grave attention. "Anonymous, but specific. Someone knew of both the manuscript's existence and the circumstances of its acquisition." Dr. Whitfield had gone rigid, his breathing shallow and rapid. "These anonymous accusations prove nothing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Anyone might write such things to cause trouble." "Indeed, anyone might write them," Poirot agreed mildly. "But consider, Doctor, whoever wrote this possessed intimate knowledge of both your professional activities and Sir Reginald's most secret acquisition. Such knowledge suggests someone very close to both parties, someone with access to confidential information that few would possess." The psychological pressure was mounting visibly. Dr. Whitfield's professional composure was cracking like ice under spring sun, revealing glimpses of the desperate man beneath. His eyes darted repeatedly to the charred remains of the labels, as if calculating whether enough evidence remained to condemn him. "The beauty of the human mouth," Poirot continued conversationally, "is that it serves so many functions. We speak, we eat, we breathe, and sometimes we unknowingly absorb substances through the delicate membranes within. A few drops of concentrated digitalis on a gummed surface, for instance, would be absorbed almost instantly when moistened by the tongue." The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Dr. Whitfield's face had gone ashen, his hands gripping the edge of the table with such force that his knuckles showed white. "You cannot prove such wild theories," he whispered, but the words carried the hollow ring of a man whose defenses were crumbling. "Perhaps not yet," Poirot replied with quiet confidence. "But the little grey cells, they whisper that proof will come. A man who commits murder through such intimate means, the victim's own saliva becoming the delivery mechanism for death. Such a man reveals much about his psychology. The desire to remain physically distant from the act, yet to ensure its absolute certainty through professional knowledge." As we prepared to leave the smoke-damaged study, Poirot paused at the doorway, his gaze fixed on the trembling physician. "The conscience, Doctor, is a most persistent thing. The arm speaks in whispers at first, then grows louder until it becomes a roar that drowns out all other thoughts. I suspect yours has been speaking to you for some time now." Dr. Whitfield's response was barely audible. "You understand nothing of the pressures, the impossible choices." "Au contraire," Poirot replied softly. "I understand that a man faced with exposure will sometimes choose the most desperate measures to preserve what he believes to be his honor. But honor built upon deception, Doctor, is no honor at all. It is merely pride wearing a mask." As we walked back toward the house, I could sense that we had crossed a crucial threshold. The murderer's carefully constructed facade was beginning to collapse under the relentless pressure of logical deduction and psychological insight. Dr. Whitfield's desperate attempt to destroy evidence had only served to confirm Poirot's theories, while revealing the depth of his guilt and fear. The game of cat and mouse was approaching its climax, and I knew that before another day passed, the truth would finally emerge from the shadows that had shrouded this most perplexing case. The impossible crime was revealing its very human origins, one carefully observed reaction at a time. The morning brought with it a brittle tension that seemed to permeate every corner of Ravenshollow, as if the very walls were holding their breath in anticipation of some inevitable revelation. Dr. Whitfield appeared at breakfast, looking haggard beyond his years, his usually steady hands trembling as he reached for his coffee cup. The confident physician who had examined Sir Reginald's body with professional detachment had been replaced by a man clearly wrestling with invisible demons that grew stronger with each passing hour. Poirot observed these changes with the keen attention of a naturalist studying a fascinating specimen. His green eyes missed nothing, not the way the doctor's gaze kept drifting toward the windows as if calculating escape routes, nor the manner in which he started at every unexpected sound. The little Belgian detective had spent decades learning to read the subtle language of guilt, and Dr. Whitfield was speaking it fluently. "Doctor," Poirot addressed him with characteristic courtesy over the morning papers. "You mentioned yesterday that certain exotic substances might escape routine post-mortem examination. As a medical man, you would naturally be familiar with compounds that could affect cardiac function without leaving obvious traces." The doctor's cup rattled against its saucer with unnatural loudness in the quiet breakfast room. "To some degree, yes, though my practice concerns itself primarily with healing rather than forensic matters." His voice carried a hollow quality that had not been present in previous conversations. But surely the principles remain similar. The absorption of substances through various means, the rapidity with which certain compounds might affect the human system. Poirot's tone remained conversational, but I sensed the steel beneath the silk. For instance, digitalis compounds extracted from common garden plants, concentrated through processes that any competent physician might accomplish with basic laboratory equipment. The color drained from Dr. Whitfield's face so completely that I feared he might faint. Before he could respond, however, Inspector Morrison arrived with news that struck the assembled company like a thunderbolt. The laboratory analysis of the charred label fragments had been completed, and the results confirmed Poirot's most audacious theory with scientific precision. The chemist was quite specific, Morrison reported, his earlier skepticism replaced by grudging admiration for Poirot's deductive powers. Someone had applied a solution of concentrated digitalis glycosides to the adhesive surface with remarkable precision. When moistened by saliva, the compound would be absorbed almost instantly through the oral mucosa, causing rapid cardiac arrest within minutes of contact. Dr. Whitfield gripped the edge of the breakfast table with such force that his knuckles showed white against the polished wood. His breathing had become shallow and rapid, and I noticed how his eyes darted repeatedly toward the door as if measuring the distance to freedom. The trap that Poirot had so carefully constructed was finally closing around its intended quarry. "Most illuminating," Poirot murmured, his gaze fixed steadily on the trembling physician. Such a method would require intimate knowledge of both the victim's habits and the precise dosage necessary to ensure death without arousing immediate suspicion. It speaks of someone who understood Sir Reginald's methodical nature, his habit of sealing correspondence with meticulous care. Lady Pembroke had gone very pale, her hand pressed to her throat as the full implications of the laboratory results became clear. "You mean to say that someone deliberately poisoned those labels, knowing that my husband would—" She could not finish the sentence, but the horror in her voice spoke volumes. "Indeed, madame. Your husband was murdered by someone who understood his character well enough to predict his actions with deadly accuracy." Poirot's voice carried infinite gentleness as he addressed the widow, but his eyes never left Dr. Whitfield's face. Someone who had observed his habits over many years, who knew that he would inevitably moisten those labels with his tongue when preparing his final correspondence. The psychological pressure was mounting visibly with each passing moment. Dr. Whitfield's professional composure, so carefully maintained throughout the investigation, was cracking like ice under spring sun. His hands shook uncontrollably as he attempted to lift his coffee cup, and when he spoke, his voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. "You cannot prove such wild theories," he said desperately, but the words carried the hollow ring of a man whose defenses were crumbling. "Laboratory results can be misinterpreted. Contamination can occur during analysis." "Perhaps," Poirot replied with quiet confidence, "but the little gray cells whisper that additional proof will emerge. A man who commits murder through such intimate means, using the victim's own saliva as the delivery mechanism for death. Such a man reveals much about his psychology. The desire to remain physically distant from the act, yet to ensure its absolute certainty through professional knowledge." As the morning progressed, Poirot continued his relentless campaign with surgical precision. He requested a detailed examination of the study safe, noting aloud how the velvet lining showed evidence of repeated disturbance, not the single theft that had been assumed, but multiple removals and replacements over time. He observed that the dust pattern suggested someone had been accessing the safe regularly, someone familiar with its contents and combination. The Ashworth Psalter, he mused thoughtfully, was perhaps not the only treasure that someone coveted. Or perhaps it was not treasure at all, but evidence that required careful monitoring. Dr. Whitfield's reaction to this observation was immediate and telling. His face went ashen, and he excused himself abruptly, claiming a sudden need for fresh air. Through the morning room windows, we watched him pace the garden paths with the restless energy of a caged animal, his movements betraying the inner turmoil that his words had failed to conceal. When he returned, Poirot was waiting with what appeared to be casual conversation about the household's medical supplies. "You maintain, I believe, a small dispensary here for the family's needs. Most convenient for a country residence where the nearest chemist might be miles away." "A few basic medications," the doctor replied carefully. "Nothing unusual for a physician attending a rural practice." "Of course, and among these basic medications, you would naturally stock cardiac stimulants, digitalis preparations for elderly patients with heart conditions." Poirot's tone remained innocent, but his green eyes held a predatory gleam. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Dr. Whitfield stood frozen, his face a mask of barely controlled desperation, while the assembled company watched with growing understanding of what Poirot's questions implied. The web of circumstantial evidence was tightening with each carefully placed inquiry, each psychological pressure point expertly applied. "The conscience, doctor, is a most persistent thing," Poirot observed softly. "It speaks in whispers at first, then grows louder until it becomes a roar that drowns out all other thoughts. I suspect yours has been speaking to you for some time now, growing more insistent with each passing hour." Dr. Whitfield's response was barely audible, his voice cracking with strain. "You understand nothing of the pressures, the impossible choices that circumstances can force upon a man." "Au contraire," Poirot replied with infinite compassion. "I understand that a man faced with exposure will sometimes choose the most desperate measures to preserve what he believes to be his honor. But honor built upon deception, doctor, is no honor at all. It is merely pride wearing a mask that grows heavier with each passing day." As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the ancient stones of Raven's Hollow, I could sense that we had crossed a crucial threshold in this extraordinary case. The murderer's carefully constructed facade was beginning to collapse under the relentless pressure of logical deduction and psychological insight. Dr. Whitfield's desperate attempts to maintain his innocence were becoming increasingly hollow, his guilt written in every trembling gesture and haunted glance. The game of cat and mouse was approaching its climax, and I knew that before another day passed, Hercule Poirot would gather all the suspects in one room for his traditional revelation of the truth. The impossible crime was revealing its very human origins, one carefully observed reaction at a time, and the locked room mystery would soon yield its secrets to the relentless logic of the little gray cells. The stage was set for the final act of this tragic drama, where justice would finally emerge from the shadows that had shrouded the truth for too long. The afternoon settled over Ravenshollow with the weight of impending revelation, that peculiar stillness that precedes the breaking of a storm. The very air seemed charged with unspoken tensions, as if the ancient walls themselves were holding their breath in anticipation of truths long buried finally coming to light. Poirot moved through the corridors with the measured precision of a master craftsman putting finishing touches to an intricate work, his green eyes bright with the satisfaction of a puzzle nearing completion. Dr. Whitfield had abandoned all pretense of professional composure. I observed him in the morning room, pacing with the restless energy of a caged animal, his hands trembling as he reached repeatedly for his brandy glass. The confident physician who had examined Sir Reginald's body with such clinical detachment had been replaced by a man clearly wrestling with invisible demons that grew stronger with each passing hour. His face bore the haggard marks of sleepless nights, and his eyes held the haunted quality of someone who knows that judgment approaches with inexorable certainty. "The conscience, mon ami," Poirot murmured to me as we watched the doctor's agitated movements from the hallway. "It is a most persistent companion. It whispers at first, then speaks, and finally it shouts until it drowns out all other thoughts. Our murderer believed himself safe behind the facade of an impossible crime, but the human mind cannot long sustain such deception without revealing its burden." The morning brought with it a discovery that would prove crucial to Poirot's final reconstruction. While examining the study once more with his characteristic thoroughness, he made an observation that had escaped everyone else's notice. The key in the locked door, which had seemed to prove the impossibility of the crime, bore microscopic scratches that told a different story entirely. "Observe, Hastings," he said, producing his magnifying glass and directing my attention to the brass key. "These marks are fresh, made by forceps or surgical instruments. Someone has manipulated this key from the outside, turning it with medical precision after securing the door from within." His eyes gleamed with satisfaction as another piece of the puzzle fell into place. The locked room was never impossible. It was merely the work of someone with both the knowledge and the tools to achieve what appeared to be the impossible. As the day progressed, Poirot continued his psychological campaign with surgical precision. He arranged for Inspector Morrison to mention, quite casually within Dr. Whitfield's hearing, that the laboratory analysis of the study's contents had revealed traces of surgical spirit on the door handle, evidence that someone had attempted to clean away fingerprints with the thoroughness of medical training. The effect on Dr. Whitfield was immediate and devastating. His face went ashen, and he excused himself abruptly, claiming a sudden need for fresh air. Through the drawing-room windows, we watched him pace the garden paths with increasing agitation, his movements betraying the inner turmoil that his words had failed to conceal. When he returned, his hands were visibly shaking, and perspiration beaded his forehead despite the cool afternoon air. Poirot was waiting with what appeared to be casual conversation about the household's medical supplies, but his questions carried the weight of final confirmation. "You maintain, I believe, a small dispensary here for the family's needs?" Poirot inquired with deceptive mildness. "Most convenient for a country residence, where the nearest chemist might be miles away." "A few basic medications," Dr. Whitfield replied carefully, his voice strained. "Nothing unusual for a physician attending a rural practice." "Of course. And among these basic medications, you would naturally stock cardiac stimulants, digitalis preparations for elderly patients with heart conditions." Poirot's tone remained innocent, but his green eyes held a predatory gleam that made the doctor flinch visibly. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Dr. Whitfield stood frozen, his professional mask finally slipping to reveal the desperate man beneath. The web of circumstantial evidence was tightening with each carefully placed inquiry, each psychological pressure point expertly applied by Poirot's relentless logic. "The beauty of digitalis," Poirot continued conversationally, "is that it can be concentrated through simple processes that any competent physician might accomplish. Applied to adhesive surfaces, it would be absorbed almost instantly when moistened by the tongue, causing rapid cardiac arrest within minutes of contact, a method that would require intimate knowledge of both the victim's habits and the precise dosage necessary to ensure death without arousing immediate suspicion." Dr. Whitfield's response was barely audible, his voice cracking under the strain. "You understand nothing of the pressures, the impossible choices that circumstances can force upon a man of honor." "Au contraire," Poirot replied with infinite compassion. "I understand that a man faced with exposure will sometimes choose the most desperate measures to preserve what he believes to be his reputation. But honor built upon deception, doctor, is no honor at all. It is merely pride wearing a mask that grows heavier with each passing day." As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the ancient stones of Ravenshollow, Poirot made his final preparations. He sent Jameson to deliver his summons with characteristic precision. "Kindly inform all members of the household that I shall require their presence in the library at 8 o'clock precisely. It is time for the truth to be revealed." The announcement created a fresh wave of anxiety throughout the house. Lady Pembroke's hands fluttered nervously at her throat, while Mrs. Ashford's usually keen eyes darted about with calculating assessment. Professor Blackwood adjusted his spectacles with scholarly anticipation, while young James Ashford looked pale with apprehension. Even Inspector Morrison seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, straightening his uniform and clearing his throat with official importance. When the appointed hour arrived, the library felt transformed from a place of learning into a courtroom where justice would finally be served. Each person chose their seat with ritualistic care, creating a tableau of nervous anticipation. Dr. Whitfield stood apart near the tall windows, his back to the room, staring out into the deepening twilight as if seeking an escape that would never come. Poirot entered last, moving to the center of the room with quiet dignity that commanded immediate attention. He surveyed the assembled company, his green eyes holding a piercing intensity that seemed to strip away all pretense and reveal the truth beneath. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the oppressive silence, "we are gathered here tonight to discuss the lamentable death of Sir Reginald Pembroke, a death that, to the casual observer, appears to have been an impossible crime, a man murdered in a locked room with no apparent means of entry or exit and no obvious cause of death." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the assembled company like a shroud. "And yet, as I have always maintained, there is no such thing as an inexplicable death. There are only deaths whose explanations we have not yet discovered. Tonight, mes amis, we shall discover the truth that has been hidden beneath layers of deception and professional respectability." The stage was set for the final revelation. The impossible crime was about to reveal its very human origins, and the locked room mystery would yield its secrets to the relentless logic of Hercule Poirot's little gray cells. Justice, long delayed, was finally ready to emerge from the shadows that had shrouded it for too long. As Poirot prepared to begin his methodical exposition of the truth, I could sense that we stood at the threshold of one of his most brilliant demonstrations of deductive reasoning. The perfect crime was about to be revealed as merely an elaborate illusion, constructed by a desperate man whose fear of exposure had transformed him from healer into harbinger of death. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence of the library like a blade through silk, "we are gathered to discuss what appears to be an impossible crime. A man murdered in a locked room with no apparent means of entry or exit, killed by no discernible cause. Yet the little grey cells whisper that impossibility is merely another word for a truth we have not yet understood. He moved to the center of the room with characteristic precision, his green eyes sweeping across each face with penetrating intensity. Dr. Whitfield remained by the windows, his shoulders rigid with barely controlled tension, while the others sat transfixed by the approaching revelation. The method was ingenious in its medical precision, Poirot continued relentlessly. Sir Reginald died from digitalis poisoning, absorbed through the oral mucosa when he moistened gummed labels with his tongue. The poison had been applied to the adhesive surface with surgical accuracy, a technique requiring both pharmaceutical knowledge and intimate familiarity with the victim's methodical habits. Lady Pembroke gasped, her hand flying to her throat. But the water dish for stamps was completely dry. Précisément, madame. Someone had deliberately removed the water, ensuring that Sir Reginald would be forced to use his tongue. The murderer understood his character perfectly, knew that he would never leave correspondence unsealed, would never deviate from his precise routine. Poirot's gaze fixed steadily on Dr. Whitfield's trembling form. The locked room presented no obstacle to someone with surgical instruments. The key bears microscopic scratches made by forceps turned from outside after the door was secured. A candle on the desk provided the dim light seen beneath the door, creating the illusion that Sir Reginald still worked. The handle was wiped clean with surgical spirit. Yours ease hum, physician's instinctive precaution. Inspector Morrison leaned forward eagerly. But the motive, Mr. Poirot? Ah, the motive lies buried in past shame and present fear. Years ago, Dr. Whitfield betrayed a patient's trust, an elderly recluse who possessed the Ashworth Psalter. The doctor revealed its existence and arranged its secret sale to Sir Reginald for a substantial fee he desperately needed. When anonymous letters began threatening exposure, he knew his carefully constructed reputation hung by the thinnest thread. Poirot's voice grew softer, more compassionate. Sir Reginald's announcement that Saturday evening was not merely about revealing a treasure, it was about exposing a betrayal that had festered for years. Public revelation would inevitably lead to questions about provenance, questions that would trace back to the doctor's unethical involvement. Faced with professional ruin and personal disgrace, he chose murder over exposure. Dr. Whitfield turned from the window, his face ashen and defeated. "The dosage," he whispered brokenly. "I misjudged it in my desperation. I never intended... I thought perhaps to make him ill, to delay the revelation while I found some way to make amends." "But murder creates more problems than it solves," Poirot observed sadly. "The theft of the manuscript was necessary to provide an alternative motive, to suggest robbery rather than betrayal. Your desperate attempt to burn the remaining poisoned labels this morning, your midnight search of the library when laboratory analysis was mentioned, each action merely illuminated your guilt more brightly. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Dr. Whitfield slumped into the nearest chair like a man whose strings had been cut, while Lady Pembroke stared at him with horrified comprehension. "Marcus," she breathed, 30 years of trust. "How could you?" Inspector Morrison stepped forward with official gravity. "Dr. Marcus Whitfield, I'm arresting you for the murder of Sir Reginald Pembroke." As the doctor was led away, his shoulders bowed with the weight of his crimes, Poirot stood quietly contemplating the human wreckage left in the wake of fear and desperation. The Ashworth Psalter was recovered from Whitfield's surgery, hidden among medical texts with pathetic hope that its value might somehow provide restitution. "The perfect crime, Hastings," Poirot murmured as we prepared to leave Ravenshollow the following morning, "exists only in the murderer's imagination. In reality, every murder leaves traces, not always physical, but always psychological. The human heart cannot bear such deception indefinitely." The locked room had yielded its secrets, but the cost in human terms was devastating. Trust had been shattered, friendships destroyed, and a healer had become a harbinger of death through the corrosive power of fear and shame. The morning after Dr. Whitfield's arrest dawned grey and subdued over Ravenshollow, as if the ancient house itself were slowly exhaling a breath it had held for days. The oppressive tension that had gripped every corridor and chamber had lifted, replaced by a melancholy quietude that seemed to settle into the very stones like morning mist. The impossible crime had been solved, but the human cost weighed heavily upon all who remained. Poirot and I took our final breakfast in the morning room, where the silence was broken only by the gentle clink of china and the distant sounds of servants going about their duties with muted efficiency. The other guests had departed early, each carrying with them the uncomfortable knowledge that they had lived for days in close proximity to a murderer whose mask of respectability had never slipped until the very end. Inspector Morrison arrived to complete his documentation, his earlier skepticism about Poirot's methods entirely replaced by professional admiration. "The laboratory has confirmed every detail, Mr. Poirot," he reported with evident satisfaction. "The typewriter in Dr. Whitfield's surgery, with that distinctive misaligned E, matches the anonymous letters perfectly. His surgical forceps show microscopic traces of brass from the study key, and we found the concentrated digitalis solution hidden among his pharmaceutical supplies." The inspector paused, consulting his notes with official precision. "He's made a full confession, signed and witnessed. Admits to the poisoning, to manipulating the locked door with his instruments, to planting young Ashford's cufflink to misdirect suspicion. Says he noticed it loose at dinner and pocketed it for that very purpose." Lady Pembroke joined us, her composure admirable yet fragile, like fine porcelain that had survived a great shock but remained forever changed. Her grief was complicated now by the bitter knowledge that her husband's death had come at the hands of someone she had trusted implicitly for 30 years. "I keep thinking of all the times Marcus sat at our table," she said quietly, her voice carrying the bewildered tone of someone trying to reconcile past kindness with present horror. "The way he delivered Daphne, tended Reginald through his pneumonia last winter, sat with us during those long nights when we feared the worst. How does a man compartmentalize such duplicity for decades?" Poirot's response carried infinite gentleness. "The human capacity for self-deception, madame, is perhaps our greatest tragedy. Dr. Whitfield convinced himself that one betrayal might be balanced by years of faithful service, that the good he had done could somehow erase the evil. But conscience is not a ledger book where debits and credits can be balanced. It is a voice that grows louder with each compromise until it becomes unbearable." The recovery of the Ashworth Psalter from Dr. Whitfield's surgery had provided its own bitter revelation. Professor Blackwood handled the precious manuscript with reverent care, his scholarly excitement tempered by the circumstances of its recovery. "The original owner was Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell," he explained, his voice heavy with the weight of historical injustice, "a reclusive widow who died alone in 1923, with only Dr. Whitfield attending her final illness. The Psalter disappeared shortly after her death, and there were whispers about irregularities in her estate settlement, but nothing was ever proven. Until now," Poirot added softly. "The anonymous letters came from her former housekeeper, an elderly woman whose conscience would not permit her to rest. She had suspected foul play for decades, but lacked proof. When Sir Reginald announced the Psalter's public revelation, she saw her final opportunity to bring the truth to light." Lady Pembroke straightened with sudden resolve, her grief transforming into determined action. "If wrong was done, then let us set it right. I shall present the Psalter to the British Museum, and the proceeds from tomorrow's auction shall go to St. Bartholomew's as Reginald intended. No shadow must lie upon this house or upon that beautiful manuscript." Professor Blackwood bowed with scholarly respect. "You honor both justice and scholarship, Lady Pembroke. I shall personally ensure that proper authentication and custodianship are arranged." Young James Ashford appeared vastly relieved, the shadow of suspicion finally lifted from his shoulders. Though his financial difficulties remained, The accusation of murder had been removed, and his aunt's stern but practical nature suggested that his debts would be addressed with appropriate conditions attached. Miss Daphne sought a private word with Poirot as we prepared our departure. The events had aged her beyond her years, stripping away the carefree manner of youth and replacing it with sobering knowledge of human fallibility. "Will he hang?" she asked directly, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "That will be for the courts to decide, mademoiselle," Poirot replied with characteristic honesty. But his cooperation with the authorities, his obvious remorse, and his previous reputation may weigh in his favor. The law recognizes the difference between premeditated murder and a desperate act born of fear and shame. As our afternoon train pulled away from the small country station, Poirot sat in contemplative silence, his green eyes fixed on the passing countryside. The rhythmic clacking of wheels seemed to echo the methodical precision with which he had unraveled the seemingly impossible crime. "The locked room mystery, Hastings," he said finally, "was perhaps the least mysterious aspect of this entire affair. The true mystery lies in understanding how a man dedicated to healing could be transformed by fear into an agent of death. Dr. Whitfield possessed all the knowledge necessary to save lives, yet he used it to take one instead." He adjusted an invisible speck of dust from his immaculate sleeve, his expression thoughtful. "We lock ourselves in, mon ami, with our vanities and our fears, and then are astonished that there is no door. The key to freedom is always inside. One needs only the courage to turn it." The countryside slid past in tired autumn colors, and I found myself reflecting on the human wreckage left in the wake of one man's desperate attempt to preserve his reputation. The perfect crime had been revealed as merely an elaborate illusion, but the imperfect human heart that conceived it remained a mystery as old as mankind itself. "In the end," Poirot murmured as the lights of London began to appear on the horizon, "it is often the smallest things that reveal the largest truths. A dry water dish, a dimmed light, the faint scent of surgical spirit, these whisper secrets that the loudest protestations of innocence cannot drown. The tongue that moistens a lie may also seal a fate, n'est-ce pas?" Despite the melancholy that surrounded the case's resolution, I could not help but smile at his observation. "Trust you, Poirot, to find profound meaning in an inkwell." "Not meaning, mon ami," he corrected gently, "merely a reminder. Order and method are admirable qualities, but without conscience to guide them, they become merely the tools of deception. Come, we shall dine at that little place in Jermyn Street. After a case so lacking in flavor, one must refresh the palate." As we left the countryside behind, I knew that in quiet moments I would still see that dim line of light beneath a study door, and hear in Poirot's calm voice the eternal certainty that no crime is perfect, and no heart, however carefully guarded, is beyond the reach of truth. The affair at Raven's Hollow had ended not with triumph, but with the sobering reminder that justice, while inevitable, often comes at a price that diminishes us all.